So before I begin, I just wanted to say a really big thank you to Luke Young for all of his tireless efforts to ensure that this symposium can go ahead, despite the obviously challenging circumstances. So thank you, and I really look forward to hearing everyone's talks. In the abstract for this talk, I made a claim, one which, having now written the paper, I would no longer quite agree with, such is the power of writing to enable a kind of working through. In the abstract, I set up a kind of opposition between what I quite readily and quite reductively described as a fatalistic streak present in a number of contemporary illness narratives, and the quite different affective orientation to illness we find in Sedgwick's later writings. Fatalism is a charged word, and one, I increasingly think, to be handled with care, one which holds largely negative connotations of acquiescence, of, as the OED notes, submission to everything that happens as inevitable. But be it Anne Boyer's The Undying, or Gillian Rose's Love's Work, or Lucy Greeley's autobiography of a Face, a submissiveness to the inevitable couldn't be further than the orientation towards being ill that we find in these pages. And in fact, the very act of writing seems to be evidence to the contrary. And anyway, as we learn from Sedgwick's own later meditations on Buddhist ideas and practices of non-being, fatalism, or the acceptance that we will one day inevitably cease to be, holds for many, including Sedgwick, consoling or even enlivening energies. In other words, binary oppositions rarely give the fullest picture. And with that thought, I'll begin. The need to bind things together again, writes Anne Hunsaker Hawkins, makes pathographical literature a rich source for the literary critic. But what if the pathography or illness narrative is penned by one who is, herself, a literary critic? One who describes her mother's milk as having been deconstruction, a critical orientation wary of established wholes and tidy unities. This paper explores some of the ways in which, from the moment of her breast cancer diagnosis in 1991, the published writings of late queer theorist Eve Kosofsky Sedgwick tend across forms, genres, styles, and registers, and considers some of the ways in which, for Sedgwick, these experimental adventures could be understood to be, in some sense, therapeutic. Following Anne Svetkovich's framing of depression as a form of being stuck, both literal and metaphorical, that requires new ways of living, or, more concretely, moving, this paper sees Sedgwick's playful perversions of form and style as a way of keeping moving, critically and creatively, in the face of a life-altering diagnosis. These paragraphs are about pleasure, not propriety, Sedgwick explains in the foreword to her 1993 essay collection, Tendencies. Seeing this intimate linking of pleasure with impropriety as something of a guiding force in her later works, this paper suggests that in moving across genders, across sexualities, across genres, across perversions, Sedgwick discovers ways of thinking, writing, and creating that not only allow her and her readers to better understand the epistemological, ontological, and affective stakes of being ill, but that also, through the very act of making, feel good, feel, as she puts it in her 1999 memoir, A Dialogue on Love, realer. And what critical apparatus better implies motion than deconstruction? A movement is interested, not like the conventional pathography, in binding things together, but in taking apparent wholes apart, examining the pieces, and imagining new and perhaps more useful uses for the salvaged parts. Describing her experimental ambitions for Tendencies as an adventure in applied deconstruction, Sedgwick notes the surprisingly therapeutic tools discovered over the course of this undertaking. I came to my encounter with breast cancer, she explains in a footnote, not as a member of a creedal set of deconstructionists, but as someone who needed all the cognitive skills she could get. I found, as often before, that I had some good and relevant ones from my deconstructive training. Even in her use of deconstruction, Sedgwick is wary of the pre-established whole. Breaking her training into its most usable pieces, Sedgwick sees what she can assemble from the parts of deconstruction deemed good, deemed relevant enough to keep her and her work moving, to resist, that could be, getting stuck. This footnote offers an object lesson in the critical and creative possibilities of paratexts. Acknowledgements and prefaces, footnotes and dust jackets, Sedgwick's later writings reveal ways in which, in times of crisis, these unassuming and quite literally marginal forms can, like Kleinian part objects, derived but detachable from the text's main body, encourage and hold some of the most useful revelations, and perhaps some of the most usable ones too. Taking this footnote seriously, this paper will suggest that as well as gaining good and relevant tools from deconstruction with which to better understand, live, and create during this encounter with breast cancer, that this diagnosis also afforded Sedgwick new ways of conceptualizing and relating to the essay form. The pressure of application, as she writes elsewhere, goes in both directions. In White Glasses, a paper presented at a City University of New York conference in May of 1991 and later published in Tendencies, Sedgwick notes the unexpected thrills of being able to read, write, and think through the lens of her recent cancer diagnosis. In many ways, she reflects, it is full of stimulation and interest even to be ill and writing. An essay in the more literal sense of an experiment, as Sedgwick describes her own book, Depression: A Public Feeling, White Glasses is a text which oscillates between two, at times seemingly contradictory modes, the obituary and the homage. Written 4 months prior to the conference as an obituary for Michael Lynch, then gravely ill with AIDS-related infection, the essay, upon its presentation to audiences at City University of New York's Center for Lesbian and Gay Studies, and for a Michael of the very near future, for whom the talk actually ended up being recorded, was delivered to Sedgwick's own surprise and excitement as an act of homage to a living friend. The strange and unpredictable temporalities of illnesses such as Lynch's and her own make novel demands of forms we might, in other circumstances, be forgiven for thinking as fixed. For what mode is, in its implications, more final, more enduring than the obituary, marking, as with a chisel to stone, the fact of another's death? And yet, like a hologram whose image changes depending on where we stand and the angle at which the light hits, this is an essay whose form shifts according to its reader's temporal positioning. Michael Lynch, Sedgwick quietly notes at the end of the published version of White Glasses, died of AIDS on the 9th of July 1991. That is, exactly a month after the paper was delivered. In some sense, then, it is only from this date that the essay starts its work as the obituary Sedgwick anticipated it would always already be. But not to the exclusion of it remaining the homage to a living friend she celebrates the paper as being in its early paragraphs. By marking the date of Michael's death at the end, rather than the beginning of the published essay, Sedgwick seems to ask, why can't this essay be both? Perhaps one of the reasons why it's so full of stimulation and interest, being ill and writing, is that, as what Sedgwick describes as the ontological crack between the living and the dead starts to thin, either or ways of thinking and of writing come to seem restrictive and limiting compared to the dynamic, intellectual, relational, and even therapeutic possibilities opened up by a both-and approach. In thinking about the therapeutic possibilities of formal experimentation and the kinds of movement it might enable, I'm guided by several of Sedgwick's own scintillating reflections on therapy and creativity made in her experimental memoir of 1999, A Dialogue on Love. Possibly the most oblique in this regard, but all the same I think one of the most suggestive, is her epiphany that therapy and pleasure belong in the same breath. If one way that pleasure comes, as Sedgwick intimates, is through certain kinds of formal impropriety, then there seems to be space to speculate that there might be, for Sedgwick, some stimulating overlaps between the pleasures of formal experimentation and therapy. In her 1987 essay, A Poem is Being Written, Sedgwick reveals just how deeply and how productively pleasure, impropriety, and therapy have been enmeshed across what she describes as her intellectual and artistic life. The essay, which precedes but is reprinted in Tendencies, calls upon a host of critical languages, psychoanalysis, formalism, and styles such as the juvenile, the academic, and even what she describes as the visibly chastised, to close read a selection of her own verse written back and forth across the years, and explore what her lifelong attachment to poetry, as a reader, as a writer, and then, in her professional capacity as literary critic, as a reader once more, might reveal. Anticipating the way in which her later memoir, Dialogue, breaks suddenly from orderly prose into chains of haiku, braided with passages from her therapist's clinical notes, A Poem is Being Written intersperses its academic come autobiographical prose with fragments of 9-year-old Eve's early, strictly disyllabic poetry. In exposing these small bodies of writing to her readers, a pleasurable, if somewhat shameful repetition of the way in which, as a child, she would bear her own small body for physical punishment, Sedgwick observes that the two most rhythmic things that happened to me when I was a child were spanking and poetry. These rhythms of spanking, of poetry, of Sedgwick's movement between a miscellany of forms and styles, are all held by the essay's wider, clinical frame. The essay's title obviously means, Sedgwick explains, to associate the shifty passive voice of a famous title of Freud's, A Child is Being Beaten, with the general question of poetry, with the scene of poetry writing, and the tableau of the poem itself. While for Sedgwick, and for many queer theorists besides, the jury is often out on whether Freudian thought can be uncomplicatedly reclaimed as therapeutic, Sedgwick, in this essay, gains some good and relevant tools from psychoanalysis, with which to traverse the decades between her present and 9-year-old self, and offer the latter, as she writes, 27 years late, the respectful critical attention her younger self would have gained so much pleasure from receiving. Here, it is not so much psychoanalysis in and of itself that functions therapeutically, but the ways in which it enables Sedgwick to move, as she puts it, across the gaps between poetry and theory, to understand and even recover some of her earliest creative pleasures. Formal impropriety, then, might not only enable, but also perform gestures of care, to oneself, past or present, or, as we find in Tendencies' vast acknowledgement section, to one's mishpoche. Translating literally as family, but often used to mean extended family and then some, this Yiddish term is italicized but left untranslated, as though Sedgwick were intimating to her own mishpoche that if you know, you know. And so Sedgwick opens this most public, yet often overlooked of forms, with a gesture of intimacy only some will, without interpretative support, recognise and understand. I suppose there's something a bit louche about it, Sedgwick begins, the way the acknowledgement convention lets one savour the pride of being indebted to wonderful friends. But far from proving a deterrent, this loucheness, combined with the tendency of acknowledgements to be overlooked by even the most well-meaning of readers, gives rise to a form capacious and extensive enough to span across 2 regularly formatted pages. Included not as an independent microchapter, but as a continuous part of Tendencies' foreword, this is an acknowledgement section which, in its positioning, and in its sheer size, is difficult to pass by. My illness, Sedgwick explains between confessional vignettes, has strengthened and, for me, qualitatively changed many of these relationships. And as relationships transform, so must the forms which attest to and hold them. The formal clipped register often taken up in acknowledgement sections yields to a voice more intimate, more confessional, more like life writing in miniature. Recognising the editorial and critical, but also overwhelmingly emotional contributions made by her extended family and then some in the process of Tendencies as Becoming, Sedgwick admits in the foreword's final, starkly indented line that the simple secret of this plot is just to tell them I love them a lot. In Tendencies, the movement of formal impropriety, the pleasure it brings, the care it enacts, emerges as one strategy in the face of illness, of working against the depressive dread, as Sedgwick expresses it in dialogue, that I may stop knowing how to like and desire the world around me. Sedgwick's adventures in applied deconstruction, in Tendencies and elsewhere, are, amongst many other things, experiments in keeping moving, in finding ways to think, write, and perhaps, above all, relate when depression threatens to fill the frame, and to find somewhere, as she writes in dialogue, the capillaries of my actual pleasure, enabled by the open-ended, exploratory, and experimental possibilities of the essay form.